Forgive me for being either crazy hype or crazy out of it, because I am recovering from a cold. Not COVID, just a normal cold, which, like, as a sidebar, is so hard to have nowadays. Like, every time I've been sick during COVID, I think this is my second time and it hasn't been COVID, I'm like almost surprised. Like, I'm like, what do you mean I can still get a common cold? Don't the common colds know it's a pandemic? Shouldn't they have put that on pause? One thing at a time or something? I don't know. Like, imagine getting like polio right now. That'd just be weird. That's like out of sync.
What do you say to taking chances?
Today we're going to talk about ebooks. I have not been a fan of ebooks like ever. Mainly because, okay, so like my pros and cons for ebooks are like pro. So I haven't been a fan of ebooks mainly because I like paper books. I like seeing my progress. I like being able to kind of track how much I've been reading. I like being able to hold something. I like the fact that someone can ask me about the book that I'm reading. There's kind of like this like hipster magic to reading a real book where, at least for millennials, I don't know if old people get this, but like, at least for millennials, like, I feel like someone sees me doing something on an iPad, they're not thinking, hey, baby girl. They're not thinking that I'm reading. They're thinking that I'm doing something technological, and thus I'm being like one of the kids and being addicted to technology, essentially. Whereas if you're reading a book, then like somehow you get like old people clout, and you also get like hipster clout because you're doing something like against the grain. I don't read I don't read because I want to be against the grain. I read because I like books, but I do think that there's a level of clout that comes with reading paperback books. Honestly, the main thing is with my ADHD brain, if I can't see my progress, then I think I'm just reading into infinity. Does anyone else get that? Like, truly, I think like my brain processes like reading an ebook as like, this book is endless. Like, it is truly the never-ending story. But I wanted to try, for the past 3 weeks, I've been trying to read ebooks to see if somehow I can start to like them, if something in them, something in me will ignite and I can like ebooks. So I read 4 over the past 3 weeks. And 3 of them were from my library's like Hoopla account. So this is, I guess, a little bit of a review of Hoopla as well. So the first one was Open Water. Open Water is a novella-length work in print copy. I think this leads into my first con that I found with ebooks right away, is that the pages change, like the page number changes depending on what device you're reading on. So like if I was reading, Hoopla has an app, so I mainly read on my iPad, but I could also read on a desktop and I could also read on my phone, both of which I did while reading these books. And the problem is the pages don't correspond. So the pages like recalculate, or at least recalculate on Hoopla, depending on the size of your screen, which makes sense. But for my brain, it like transitioning between my iPad and my phone meant that I was like losing progress because my page count was like less or more depending on how I was transitioning. And I didn't like that. I think this is like a big issue for someone like me who reads like to a certain page number or reads like a certain page quota every time, because it wasn't beneficial to me, and it made it really difficult to see how much I was reading of a book. So for Open Water, I ended up reading it in one day, which I thought was more beneficial because then that stuff didn't really affect it as much. I could just like keep powering through, but it did fuck with my brain. Anyway, Open Water is a book. It's about 2 Black English people, and they're living in London, and it's a love story, but it's also a story about trauma, about being a black man in England, about immigration and a lot of violence and police brutality in a way that, from an American reader, was really interesting. I do have family members who live in London, so I'm kind of familiar with both, as much as I can be, both news stories, I guess. It was really cool to see black trauma coming from, like, not American trauma. So that was very insightful. It's really sad. It's not a happy love story. It's definitely a story that focuses on black pain and, like, black generational pain. So prep for that. But it is also, the prose are gorgeous. This is one of those books where I'm glad it was a novella, because I think personally, books that are, like, really poetic, it can be hard to, like, extend that to a very large book. Like, even like 350 pages of, like, purple prose is, like, a little bit too much for me personally. I'm not a fan usually of literary fiction as well. So a book like this that was pretty bite-sized, purple prosy, contemporary, but, you know, easy to read, like quick to read, was really good for me. I've been trying to get more into literary fiction. I'm just triggered from school, so it's gonna take a little while. But I thought that this was a great look into it. The second book that I read via ebook, I also read in one day. I will say, I think that reading it in one day was, like, way easier for my brain. Way easier. So I think that, like, something that I gathered was that reading a novella as an ebook doesn't bother me so much. Reading not a novella bothers me a little bit more. We'll get into that. The second novella that I read was Coffee Boy. And Coffee Boy it's by the same author who wrote Peter Darling. It is also a trans queer romance story. This one takes place in a, like, political office space, and the main character is working with being trans in the work environment and what that means for him, how that interacts with his job, how he feels like he's not really cut out for whatever he's passionate for because he's trans, and because everyone's going to treat him different, especially in something with politics where there's, like, a face to it. I really vibed with this because I have the same issue with acting. I love acting, and there were times in my life where I was told that I should pursue acting as a career, but being trans and being trans non-binary especially makes it really hard, because everybody thus makes the assumption that the director is making the claim that the character is trans, or making the claim that the character is non-binary, and there just isn't, like, a space for actors like that very often. Even in, like, queer theater, it's not as prolific as it should be, and it's also, like, queer theater. Like, there are queer theater troupes, but that's really where you're put, if that makes sense. So it just like really, really limits you, and then you feel like you can't have a career. So I felt that. The book was really cute. I read it in one sitting. I think I preferred Peter Darling, but mainly my critique of the book was based on the fact that both Peter Darling and this book, Coffee Boy, involved essentially the same kind of pairing. Not that they didn't have separate personalities, because they definitely were like, each character was individual. However, like, both of them involved, like, a pretty large age difference. Both of them involved kind of like a a hierarchy of positions, and both of them involved trans men, which, I mean, I don't mind. I will read that story a bazillion times, but it's also like the same story. So that was my main critique for that one. My reading experience with that one was pretty much the same with Open Water. I think that I read this primarily on my iPad, and reading on your iPad's fine. I don't like that I have to charge my book. And personally, as someone who doesn't usually read at night, I don't think that like backlighting actually is like a pro or a con for me, but I guess it could be a pro or a con. If you're like a night reader, this is probably like turn up. Or if you're somebody who travels really often, that could be turn up. I don't know. If you're just at home though, I don't know why you can't just get a straight up book. The next two books that I read were both read over a series of like over 3 days. And the first one was Song for the Unraveling of the World, which was a series of short stories. And I did set myself up kind of for failure with this one because short stories, I can't like read short story books in one sitting. I like want to like read one short story a day, if that makes sense. Like I don't like going straight from one short story to another. It doesn't let me digest things very properly. So I read this because I'd been wanting to read it for a while, and my library only has it on ebook. So I was like, I'll throw it in the mix. But then I was stuck with this same conundrum of I really struggle to read short story collections, period. And then I really struggle to read short story collections in one sitting. So I ended up like not being able to read it one day and having to put it down and like and oscillating. So it's a horror collection. It's very uncanny, I would say. It's not like gory. It's just like really odd, which is what I prefer in horror just because I hate jump scares. The stories were all exceptionally compelling. I just think that I didn't like set myself up for a good ebook experience because of other things. And the last ebook I read this experiment was The Latinist. This is a new release, so it wasn't on Hoopla yet. And it was great. I'm really liking it. I'm not actually done with it. I've got like 60 pages left. But I, as someone who studied Latin, not to the PhD degree, but I have studied Latin in college, really enjoyed the amount of work that the author put into making this as accurate as possible. She really worked hard to talk about both like the graduate programs for like classical literature and also like Latin itself. Like there are like a whole bunch of like translations and scansions and all of that juicy shit is like in here, which was not something that I expected. I expected it to be more dark academia. So when I had heard about this book, I thought that it was one of those books on the long list of books that was going to be like The Secret History by Donna Tartt. But I will say that reading it now, I think that there are like obvious similarities. I think that one could argue that it's dark academia. However, now we're going into a sidebar. I wonder if dark academia, like, is the definition, if one of the definitions of a dark academic book or movie or whatever, that there's a murder involved. I'm just thinking of the dark academia that I have read, like The Secret History and If We Were Villains, both of which were essentially mystery thrillers. But, so is that like the definition? Like, is that a part of the definition? Because if that's the case, then there hasn't been a murder yet. But at the same time, like, there are definitely crimes. I don't know if like arrestable crimes, but there are crimes going on. Anyway, I guess we're going to have to dissect dark academia at some point, and I'm going to have to figure out if that is involved in the definition. So far, there hasn't been a murder. So I was expecting it to be more dark academia than it was. What it really turns out to be is more of a discussion on integrity in the academic world. And also, it's very loosely I don't even want to call it retelling. It harkens a lot to the Apollo and Daphne myth, where Daphne turns into a tree because Apollo is going to rape her. One of the things that I found really interesting about this is that where I studied Latin, I studied in a women's college. And so everything was seen a little bit more through a feminist lens. For example, my capstone thesis was on the myth of Cupid and Psyche, and there was a whole bunch of scholars who had argued that Psyche's quest was like just rife with phallic symbols, which I just thought was sexist and bullshit. And when I was reading up on this literature, I was talking to my advisor about it, and she was like, oh yeah, that's just, this guy like sipped too much of like Freud's Kool-Aid. This isn't considered like scholarly in the sense of like people actually take this serious like now in the fucking modern era. So that's like kind of where I was coming from, where I could go to my professor and be like, well, I think that this person is inherently discredited because obviously they come from, like, their argument is essentially the patriarchy, and that isn't an acceptable argument. Like, I'm going to include them in my paper as like a way to like roast them, but I'm not going to include them because I think that they have good ideas. And obviously this was a unique experience for a women's college degree, baby, because that's just not how life works. And the Latinist goes into this. The main character, Tessa, is writing one of her theses on the Apollo and Daphne myth from Ovid, and she's trying to tell her advisor, like, I don't think that these people are credible because they're arguing that Daphne might be in love with Apollo too, or that like it might be sad that Apollo, you know, falls in love and then it's unrequited. And she's like, no, that's not sad. Like this is a rape story, and that's obvious. And the professor, her advisor, essentially says like, well, you have to include it. You have to include it. And also he kind of doesn't agree with her. Like he is reticent to say that it is a rape story, which is unacceptable and is something that I never experienced. So when I was first reading it, I was like, what the fuck? Coming from my experience, if a critiquer of my thesis had made that claim that I should have argued, at least for a paragraph, like if I should have given space to Apollo's pain at all in this thesis, that just plays into rape culture. Like I would have been exceptionally insulted, and Tessa is exceptionally insulted because it's playing into rape culture, and it's playing into rape culture in the academic world. And I know that classicists aren't considered the most progressive. Like we're dealing with texts that are fucked up, and I just thought that was a really hot take. Like that happens a lot, and I'm sure that happens in other academic fields as well. And so I thought that was really sweet. So mainly the story has been about this woman trying to find her own space in a field which is inherently sexist and continues to be. So if there's a murder, then there's that. But I don't know. Like freaking this experiment literally just has like validated my opinions on ebooks. I feel like if I can read it in one setting, it's fine. If I definitely got used to it though. I think like reading The Latinist, I'm like more in the groove with it. My brain has a little bit acclimated to reading off of my iPad. So maybe like after a while, like maybe if I read only ebooks for a longer amount of time, I would feel more calm about it. At the same time though, like I still miss paper books. I will say though, it did bring a lot of conversation into my workplace. People would see me, because I'm always reading, people would see me reading from my iPad and be like, oh, like you're reading an ebook. And then this conversation would ensue, which made me laugh because, like, on one hand, they know, like, they've only seen me read paper books. So I can understand why this change would incite conversation. But a lot of people had a lot of things to say about ebooks, and the general consensus was that ebooks are less than paper books, which I don't, they're still books. But I think it's funny because so many people brought up the fact that in like 2011, people were convinced that the Nook was going to destroy the book industry, was just going to wipe out libraries altogether. 10 years, like a decade after this kind of boom of e-readers, and it's really preferential. Like, if you want to read on an ebook, you read on an ebook. If you don't, then you read a paper book. I think that industries forget that people can be stoutly old-fashioned, if that makes sense. Not to say that I think that it's old-fashioned to read paper books, just that I think that people forget that people cling so hard to what they're used to. And this obviously is super bad sometimes, but I like paper books because those are the books that I've read. If I were a kid who was raised only with ebooks, I'd probably think that paper books are really weird, but I wasn't. Paper books physical books are something that have been a part of my life forever. And so there's a comfort there. There's something solid that I can remember, that I can attribute to a wonderful past of reading. And I think that if, moving forward, if we really are going to push for this, or if this is becoming a push, then new generations might be more on the fence about it, might be a little bit more wishy-washy. I think that, there's stout defenders, but I also think, in my job, I work at a library. In my job, the people who read e-readers the most are retirees. Now, even in that people group, there are people who do not read ebooks, just like there are people who do not read audiobooks. It's all like different strokes for different folks. But I do think that it's interesting that the people who have made that jump kind of first have been an older population. And I wonder if there's something to that. If it's nice that, you can change the font size, if it's nice that it's not so heavy. I don't know. Someone will have to tell me how they feel on the paper ebook train to see. But I've noticed, at least in my workplace, that the populations that tend to lean toward that aren't the younger generations. Once again, different strokes for different folks. I think that I'm never going to be able to supplement unless something horrible, catastrophic happens and print books just aren't a thing, just over with. Obviously, I'll have to get my rocks off somehow. But it would take that, and only that, for me to not read paper books. But it was a fun experiment.